Dear Jones, I'm very happy that you dedicated time to talk more about your newspaper regarding the earthquake which occurred in the 5th century in Petra. To be more precise, the date of the date of the earthquake happened in 1418, 1419. Was that winter 1418, 1419? And what kind of historical evidence we have regarding that disaster?
Right. That's a good question, actually. I think theoretically the dates would have been summer, although I'd have to check up on that again. The historical documentation, when we compare it to some other known earthquakes, even known earthquakes of the period, is relatively limited. So we know that there was some kind of earthquake that affected generally the region of the southern Levant in probably 419. The best documentation we have actually does say 419, and I'm kind of leaning more toward that date. But really, the historical evidence that we have for it is limited to, there have been some historians who've worked on this. Basically, the assumption is that there was some letter that had circulated that mentioned there was an earthquake in this year, and that gets filtered to us through a number of sources that seem to draw on the information in that letter. So one of the major sources we have is Mercelino's Comes, who's a 5th century author, who mentions that there was an earthquake in 419 and it destroyed many cities and towns in Palestine, but that's really all he says. And then there are other sources that basically kind of repeat that same information, but they mention Jerusalem specifically. And so we know that there's some kind of earthquake happening in that year. It affects Jerusalem and it probably affects the region around Jerusalem, but the documentation doesn't tell us a lot else. So compared to the 363 earthquake that happened, just 50 years before, there we have similar evidence where probably there was a letter coming from a bishop or somebody, and it gets, again, used in these later sources, but that one is much more specific. So it tells us the names of a lot of the cities. It tells us Raqam or Petra was half destroyed by the earthquake and so on. So the evidence for the 419 earthquake is a lot more vague in that sense. We have historical evidence that it occurred and that it affected a certain region, but we don't really know the places within that region from that evidence, if that makes sense.
What was the magnitude of that earthquake in 1418, 1419? We have historical records that will witness about the destruction which happened in Petra, in Jerusalem, in East and West Bank?
That is a good question too. And the short answer there is whenever we're trying to reconstruct the magnitude of ancient earthquakes, we kind of have to rely on a couple of different sources of evidence. So there were archaeoseismologists, people who work on ancient earthquakes, who tried to attribute an intensity to a magnitude to the earthquake of 419. So it sort of suggested that it was this very high magnitude event, probably with an epicenter near Suffolk, basically, around the Sea of Galilee. And the reason for that was that it was thought at the time this came out that one of the big regions this earthquake affected was the Galilee. But it turns out that's not the case. So a lot of these sites where you had these supposed 419 earthquake destructions, Jody Magnus went back and looked at a lot of these sites in detail over a number of years and found that basically all of them had been misdated. So there were these destruction layers where you have coin evidence that basically trails off right at the beginning of the 5th century. But if you look at the pottery, the pottery continues into at least the late 5th at all of these sites, and usually into the 6th century. And so she pointed out none of these are actually 5th century earthquake destructions, or at least early 5th century earthquake destructions. Something else is happening. So that kind of weakens this hypothesis about the epicenter, and then kind of weakens the hypothesis about the magnitude as well, because the way that the magnitude is reconstructed is you start to think, okay, looking at modern earthquakes, or looking at earthquakes that we know in more detail, what kind of magnitude do you need to destroy, over this much area? And so there's sort of this assumption like, all right, if we're destroying stuff in the Galilee and also destroying Jerusalem, we probably have this epicenter closer to the Galilee because we have more sites there, and it's going to be a pretty big earthquake to destroy things in Jerusalem. But at this point, we're less sure, because we know that most of those Galilee sites weren't destroyed, and we don't know what the scale of destruction in Jerusalem was. And so my inclination when thinking about the epicenter is that we're probably talking about something farther to the south, probably concentrated around the Jordan Valley, probably at the northern tip of the Dead Sea, which is where, it's a pretty seismically active area, the whole Dead Sea Rift Valley. There have been earthquakes on that for a very long time, and so it's not surprising that there would be an epicenter there. But the magnitude we're a little bit less able to say. I would guess probably a smaller event than people have described in the past, but still strong enough that it's probably causing some destruction, especially right in that region, sort of the northern Dead Sea region. So who knows, possibly also affecting the area like to the west of Amman as well.
What happened with the previous earthquake in 4th century? How destructive was the previous earthquake which occurred in 4th century? And what kind of in 363, to be more precise. In 363, we had quakes which affected the area, including Jerusalem.
Yeah, and like I mentioned before, the 363 earthquake, we have pretty good evidence, in particular from a manuscript called Harvard Syriac 99, which is again a letter describing all of that destruction. And that one, we actually have pretty good evidence for it being, we would probably think, an earthquake of a higher magnitude and certainly affecting a bigger area than the earthquake of 419. So for the 363 earthquake, we have a lot of documented destruction. If you've done any archaeological work or read any archaeological reports of any site in central or southern Jordan, you've probably seen that site has a 363 destruction layer if it was occupied during the 4th century. So virtually every excavation in Petra has revealed, if it's found a Byzantine occupation, has revealed a 363 destruction layer. In Wadi Araba, many sites have 363 destructions. When we were excavating with Tom Levy and Mohammed Najjar at Khirbet Feinan, we have a 363 destruction layer at Khirbet Feinan. As you know, probably from talking to Dino Politis, in Horsafi, there are tombstones that specifically mention that people died in the earthquake of 363 because so many buildings collapsed. So yeah, that earthquake, we have good evidence, was very, very destructive and over a pretty wide area. So like Apollonia, which is a town in what at the time would have been pretty far western Palestine, west of Jerusalem, not quite to the coast, but still pretty far west. Apollonia is also very, very heavily damaged in the 363 earthquake. So we're talking about an area covering much of the southern Levant. And that evidence is a bit more secure, I would say. We have much better evidence that was a pretty major earthquake, and that's causing destruction basically everywhere.
Regarding 1418-19 earthquake, you use Marcelino's comments as an evidence, as a scribe who covered the earthquake of 1418-1419. What else we know from his texts?
Quite a lot actually. So I wouldn't, necessarily say that I'm a scholar of late Roman and Byzantine history. This is really sort of at the very early end of what I do, and I'm mostly kind of interested from the archaeological perspective. But Marcellinus Comes is the source is called Chronicon, and so it's basically just kind of a chronicle of events. And so he's going through and listing these things happening in the various provinces of the Roman Empire that are sort of worth recording. And so one of those is there was a big earthquake in Palestine, it destroyed some stuff, but at the same time, he's telling us, like, what are the emperors doing? What's happening, in Constantinople? What's happening in, Antioch? What's happening in all of these major cities of the empire as well? And so it's kind of why we would sort of hope, as archaeologists and historians mostly interested in the region that we're working in, that our sources would be equally interested in the region we're working in. But in this case, we have a source who really isn't as interested in the region we're working in. He's interested in very, very major events that are happening there, but it's definitely not an event, or not a source that's primarily telling us about events in historical Palestine and historical Arabia. It's much more concerned with the core areas of the Roman Empire, but it's a very useful source in that sense.
Yeah, so you think that Comes is a credible source for events in Palestine and Jordan. Of course, at that time, the whole area was part of Palestine and separated in different provinces that moved horizontally. What archaeological evidence you have for that earthquake of 1418, 1419? Now we're talking about your field.
Right. And so this is actually where I initially kind of got into this project, was basically trying to think exactly about what is the historical and archaeological, and to some extent seismic, evidence for this event. And the short answer is a lot less than I initially expected in some ways. So in the Galilee, as I mentioned, there are all of these sites that supposedly had these destruction layers. And when those were really investigated in more detail again, it turned out none of these date to the early 5th century. So none of these really can credibly be associated with this earthquake. There are a couple others as well, where when you really start picking at the evidence, they kind of fall apart. So like Apollonia is supposed to have a destruction layer from this event, but it's not totally clear how you would distinguish that from a 363 destruction layer. And then there's sort of this problem of, if you only have one destruction layer there, it would be more sensible to associate it with 363, because we have this historical documentation from Harvard CIRAC 99 telling us that the city of Apollonia is mostly destroyed in the 363 earthquake. So dating it to 419 is sort of, it makes less sense. In the sort of like southern Negev deserts, there's a couple of sites that have 5th century destructions, but those seem to be very local. They're not associated with the earthquake of 419. The evidence is just a bit too late. And that's also a very seismically active region at a kind of smaller scale, where there actually is evidence that earthquakes occur there that really only affect that region, but sometimes can have effects that are archaeologically noticeable. And so that brings us back to southern Jordan. There were a couple of sites where destruction layers from 419 were identified, mostly in Petra. And that's kind of the crux of the paper, at least as far as I was investigating. So the main one was Azantor, which if you've not been to Petra, it's essentially these Nabatean mansions on the hill behind the Great Temple, behind the Roman colonnaded streets. And one of those, actually a couple of them, but one in particular, was occupied into the late Roman period and probably into even the later Byzantine period. And the archaeologists who investigated that, mostly a Swiss team, they identified evidence of 2 earthquakes in the Byzantine period, and they dated one quite sensibly to 363. And that destruction, I think, everyone has pretty much agreed that is a 363 earthquake destruction. It's very difficult to argue it would be anything else. And then there's a rebuilding phase and another earthquake destruction on top of that they dated to 419. And the reason that I started investigating this to begin with is there are a couple of things that become uncomfortable if we date that destruction to 419. The biggest is we have this type of lamp that's very, very common in the region around Petra. It's often called a Negev wheel-made lamp, sometimes a boot-shaped lamp or an inkwell lamp, because it does kind of look like an inkwell with a spout attached to it. And at almost every site where those occur, they date to between the 6th and 8th century. So they're sort of one of our very typical, I would call it like a transitional type. They appear in the late Byzantine period. They continue into the earlier part of the early Islamic period. And that's kind of their main dates of appearance. But a lot of them were found in this later phase at Asantur. And so if we want to date Zantur's destruction to 419, we have to have this lamp appearing in the early 5th century. But if you look at the evidence for it appearing in the early 5th century, there were a couple of sites where this was claimed, and Jody Magnus again looked at the pottery from those sites and determined actually virtually all of these sites have 6th century pottery that is associated with these lamps. So Zantur kind of becomes the main site for saying maybe these lamps do start to appear a little bit earlier. Maybe they're not late Byzantine, maybe they appear in the early Byzantine, or if we want to divide this very short period into 3 phases, the middle Byzantine, which would sort of be like our 5th century Byzantine phase. And so that's what I was investigating at Zantur. And I kind of took the approach as I was looking through this data that I was just going to assume that the excavators had done the best job possible and take the data they presented at face value. So I'm not really going back and suggesting they did anything wrong. I think actually their excavation was really good. And I didn't take a look at any unpublished data. So really all I was trying to say was, if we look at the published evidence from Azantur, from the phase they call Spät Römisch II or Late Roman II, does that evidence actually point us to a date in the early 5th century? And the conclusion that I had to come to was no, not really, because there are just, again, these pieces of evidence that don't quite fit. So they have, as is the case at a lot of these sites, as was the case at these sites in the Galilee, the coins start to kind of fade out right at the beginning of the 5th century. And we can come back and talk about that in more detail if you want to.
Yeah, of course.
That's an interesting point.
We can talk about the numismatical evidence.
Yeah.
And coins that you studied.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that in a second and deal with the archaeological, or I guess more of the sort of stratigraphic evidence first. The main problem is that even if we sort of accept that you might use a decline in coin frequencies as evidence of this earthquake happening, there are just a couple of coins that don't fit. So there's a coin of the mid 5th century that occurs in the same layer, like the 450s, which you wouldn't expect to find in a 419 destruction layer. There are a couple of coins that, although they can't be precisely dated, they're probably later 5th century issues as well. And then the ceramic assemblage is kind of weird too. So local pottery we could maybe make the argument that some of that has been misdated. So for these, wheel-made lamps that we're trying to date, we could make the argument, well, we don't know where they're produced. We don't know their exact dates of production. Maybe they have a longer production than we've recognized. But the site also has imported pottery. And during this period in particular, the early 5th century, we're looking at kind of a transitional phase of these imports, but most of the imports that we see in Jordan during that period, ceramic imports, are coming from North Africa and primarily from Tunisia. The 5th century is really when that starts to change, and more of those imports start coming in from Anatolia, from kind of different regions of mostly Western Turkey, right on the coast. But we're not quite getting those in big quantities in the early 5th century. So we're mostly, and even throughout the 5th century, it's still more common to get these North African imports. And those are present at Zantor. And the ones that are present are, again, not quite of the same date. So there are forms that we could maybe make the argument that we get an early appearance at Zantor, except that they don't appear at their production sites in Tunisia until, in some cases, the middle of the 5th century. And so again, it's hard to make the argument that they would appear in a destruction layer of 419 in Jordan if at the sites with the kilns, they're not appearing until 440, 450, something like that. And there are some other forms that just don't quite fit. So forms that we know in Jerusalem show up a little bit later. Forms, in some cases, like the famous Aqaba amphory, we know that those do make an appearance in the early 5th century, but they're much, much more common as we get later into the 5th and 6th centuries. So there is 5th century and late 4th century material in this occupation phase, but it actually seems like that occupation phase lasts longer than the excavators suggested. And so probably it's not a 419 destruction. And this starts to make sense when you think about the rest of archaeology in Petra, because Zantor is one of the only sites in Petra, one of the only excavations in Petra, where the excavators have dated a destruction to 419. And we would expect that if there's this big earthquake, it's big enough to destroy this sort of settlement within Petra, you would expect it to destroy other things that were occupied during that same period in Petra too. But at most other excavations in Petra, we get 2 earthquake destructions, virtually the same that you see in Zantor, but the later destruction is always dated to sometime in the 6th century. Early on, so if we're talking about the 80s and 90s, those destructions would mostly be dated to 551, the famous Beirut earthquake. Now that's been questioned, in part because it doesn't really seem like the Beirut earthquake even caused much destruction in Jerusalem, as far as we can tell from the historical sources. So destruction in the south near Petra is unlikely. Probably the earthquake destruction that we're actually looking at is an earthquake destruction that's very, very poorly documented. It was something that was identified by Fawzi Zayedin during his excavations on the Kerak Plateau, specifically at Rabbah, or ancient Areopolis. There's this sort of weird inscription that basically mentions that a building was founded after the great earthquake in the year 597, essentially. And so we don't know what year that earthquake occurred exactly. We know that it probably occurred at the later part of the 6th century because this rebuilding is happening in 596, 597. The Roman calendar doesn't quite convert to our own all that easily. But we're not exactly sure how big it was. It doesn't show up in any of our major historical chronicles, but this inscription kind of seems to indicate there's some sort of local event that is affecting the Kerak Plateau. And Tita Niemi and other scholars have argued that is probably what we're looking at in Petra. So we've got this 363 destruction that's very big. We've got a late 6th century destruction, probably the Areopolis earthquake, which we would like to know a lot more about. And I think archaeoseismologists are increasingly finding out more about. And that's probably what we have at Zantur also. And I think at Zantur it might be a little bit complicated because the pottery evidence wouldn't necessarily push us toward a late 6th century date, at least the pottery they published. But if we're taking those lamps into account and we're not dating them to the early 5th century anymore, those would push us into the 6th century. And so I think it's worth considering. You might have an occupation lasting into the 6th century. Maybe the residents of that house just leave, they move somewhere else. Maybe it's abandoned and then it collapses in the 6th century. Maybe it is occupied into the late 6th century, but at a lower level. But those seem to be our two collapses, and that occurs all over Petra. So Jebel Haroun has the same thing, 363 in late 6th century. The Petro Church may very well. The Great Temple seems to have roughly the same thing. Again, in Fainan, too, we have the same thing, 363 in one area, that collapses, and then they move sort of that residence a little bit to the west, and that then collapses sometime in the late 6th century, which is what the pottery evidence would push us to. It's a little bit hard to tell between 551 and late 6th century, and to some extent it doesn't really matter in talking about the 419 earthquake. So I guess that's kind of the answer. Is it seemed like there might be archaeological evidence for this event in Petra, and actually it's looking like probably there isn't. And then that just leaves us with Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is a problem because Jerusalem is a major city. Of course, Petra is a major city as well, but Jerusalem's a major city.
Jerusalem was more significant, of course.
Yeah. And Jerusalem is in some ways more significant because it continues to be very, very heavily occupied long after that period, even until today, of course. And so part of the complication in Jerusalem is, we do in some of the excavations see evidence for, okay, there's walls that are destroyed and rebuilt or something like that. But Jerusalem was also affected by the 363 earthquake. And then we know from historical documentation that the Byzantine Empress Eudocia had a major reconstruction effort where she had many of the walls of Jerusalem rebuilt in the middle of the 5th century. And so we're kind of left with this problem of, in Jerusalem, it's very unlikely that something just collapses and people say, okay, well, we'll leave it at that. And we find a very nice earthquake collapse in that sense. It's much more likely that we find evidence for the earthquake from rebuilding of the walls. But deciding between, okay, this is a 363 repair, this is a 419 repair, this is a 450s repair, is very hard on the basis of just looking at the evidence from the walls. Archaeologists would really love to be able to tell between periods separated by only that much space, but we often can't date things that precisely. So the short answer is there's really not very good archaeological evidence for this event virtually anywhere, even in the places where we know that it's historically well documented, which doesn't mean it didn't occur, but I think does sort of push us to the conclusion that probably we're talking about an event that mostly impacted the region around Jerusalem, that region right at the northern end of the Dead Sea. And its effects were perhaps not quite as big as Marcellinus Comes would lead us to believe. Even if it probably did cause some destruction, and probably we were looking at a sizable earthquake that was quite frightening to be in, which is something else to consider too. Being from California, certainly I've been in my fair share of earthquakes, and even earthquakes that don't cause major destruction can be pretty frightening. So an earthquake that causes some buildings to collapse, even if as archaeologists we look at it and say like, that's nothing compared to 363. Well, if you hadn't lived through the earthquake of 363 and that was your first major earthquake, it probably would have left a pretty lasting effect on you.
Of course. There's also a hyperbolical claim that the earthquake in 1418, 1419 led to the massive conversion of Jerusalem Jews and pagans into Christianity. from which sources we have these claims?
That again basically comes from the same sources. So like a lot of sources drawing on this letter make this claim basically that, okay, this event was so massive that, yeah, it caused this mass conversion of Jews and pagans to Christianity. And I suppose that's possible, but on the other hand, it's one of those claims that strikes us as being exactly the sort of claim that we would expect to see in Byzantine sources that are primarily approaching this from a Christian religious perspective, where their perspective is essentially, okay, this event is so massive and demonstrates, so thoroughly the power of God that it would cause these conversions. Although again, we might start to wonder in some ways why that would be the case specifically for this earthquake too. We know there had been many earthquakes in the region before, and so if all earthquakes are going to cause this mass conversion, why wouldn't others? And maybe there is something about the symbolism surrounding this earthquake, or specifically what it destroys in Jerusalem, that maybe does lead some people to sort of have this response of thinking that this is a sign that they should convert. And in some ways, without better documentation of what was destroyed or better archaeological evidence of what was destroyed, we can't necessarily think about what that was. But yeah, that is a claim that those sources make. Though again, I think when we're talking about, things like religious conversion and groups of people who don't share the religious conviction of the author mass converting to the religion of the author, we do have to treat that with a bit of skepticism sometimes. We all, of course, I think, tend to privilege our own perspectives in some ways when we write, just naturally, and our ancient sources are doing the same thing. And so I would wonder whether there is sort of some core of this in terms of people that the author of the letter talked to specifically, and that's basically just being to some extent blown out of proportion a bit, which I think we also have a tendency to do in some ways when we assume that anecdotes that we can rely on have a much broader application than they actually do. Sort of that difference between anecdotal stories and data that we have from surveys or things. So I think probably that's what we're looking at, that there are a couple of anecdotes that the Bishop of Jerusalem or somebody was aware of through these conversions, and then made that into this much bigger story that then appears in our historical sources as they're being drawn from this letter. And I think that's probably important to remember too, is that the historical sources are drawing on a letter that probably went from the Bishop of Jerusalem to another religious figure. And so some of these religious claims are initially probably boasts also. The bishop sort of saying like, oh, I had so many people convert to Christianity because I was able to show them the light through this sign, this earthquake that happens.
What we know about the synagogues in Galilee, which were affected by the earthquake in 1418, 1419, because according to different researchers that you mentioned in your paper, not all synagogues were destroyed at the same time.
Yeah, and that is kind of one of the problems pushing us away from associating these sites with the earthquake of 419. There's often this problem in archaeology that time gets averaged a bit. And so if you have destructions that all look roughly similar in terms of the artifacts you're finding in them, you assume that the destructions all have basically the same cause. I mean, even when I talk about, the earthquake destructions in Petra, we're kind of doing the same thing. Like we have these destructions. The pottery generally seems to be early 4th century, so we assume that's a 363 earthquake destruction. And that happened in Galilee. But yeah, as you mentioned, closer inspection reveals, first off, almost all of the synagogues were occupied past the early 5th century, most of them into the late 5th or early 6th century. And the destructions have a number of different causes, as you said. So maybe some of them are destroyed in earthquakes, but that doesn't seem to be the case for all of them. And there are other possibilities. One of those possibilities, I'm not sure that I retain this in the final version of the paper, but there's sort of a wave of anti-Jewish violence throughout the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, not in the early 5th century, but a bit later in the 5th century. And that might also be the cause of destruction of some of these synagogues. We
I
actually have
think
historical evidence.
they were vandalized by local Christians.
Potentially, I think not all of them. We're not talking about something where every Christian in, the East is doing acts of vandalism. But yeah, we do have historical evidence that a number of synagogues were vandalized during this period. It's possible that probably a small number of synagogues were destroyed during this period by those waves of violence. Again, we're not talking about something, that's every day, but sort of there are these like upwellings of violent feelings that do seem to have some effect. And I think that's probably another thing that we're seeing. And so probably what we're looking at is really a bit more complicated than all of these synagogues being destroyed through the same processes or at the same time. As you said, there's evidence that we're looking at a couple of different things going on here. It's possible for some of them too that we are basically looking at processes of abandonment at some of them. So again, perhaps maybe as a result of these sort of waves of persecution by Christians, Jewish communities move or they decide to sort of band together. Some of those communities are possibly abandoned, and buildings, when they fall out of repair and fall out of use, often will eventually collapse over time, not always completely, but as they get robbed out a bit for stone and things like that. That might be the case for some of them as well. But yeah, it's definitely a more complex process in that case. And the sort of work that Jody Magnus did to go back and really very closely analyze the published ceramics has done a lot to tell us about how each of them seems to have a slightly different settlement history, and they don't all continue to be used for the same exact amount of time.
Do we have the archaeological evidence for Jerusalem during the earthquake in 1418 and 1419? Or it's not the case?
No, really not archaeological evidence. Again, that's kind of a problem. We just because of the earlier earthquake, because of the later repairs, we have evidence that there is rebuilding and reconstruction going on in the 5th century, but it's one of those periods where simultaneously it's a bit difficult for us to get a handle on archaeologically. Coinage does actually disappear a little bit during that period. The pottery of the 5th century is arguably harder to recognize than pottery of the 4th or 6th centuries, in part because the 5th century pottery kind of continues those traditions and begins those 6th century traditions in some cases. And so really for the early 5th century, though, we're talking mostly about continuity of 4th century traditions. So it's a bit hard to recognize where we might have evidence of those earthquake destructions. They kind of just disappear into that general kind of 5th century, late 4th century phase of reconstruction, repair. And so, yeah, we have evidence of 5th century repairs, but whether we can attribute them to 419 or not, we're really not entirely sure about that.
how coins can help us dating the destruction caused by earthquake in 5th century, in 1418, 1419. What's the use of numismatic evidence in your research?
Right, so that's a big question as well, and a good one. Coins are really important to archaeologists. One of the things about coins is they're often the most precisely datable artifacts that we have in an excavation. Some of them even just say the year they were minted. Others at least tell us what, in the case of the Roman and Byzantine period, what emperor they were minted under. And so we know at least it must date to that emperor's reign. And because of that, there's often a tendency to assume that coin finds provide the best date for an archaeological context. We tend to want to associate the coins that we find with whatever the date of that context is. And sometimes that works. But the problem with coins also is that coins are not always minted at the same frequency. So sometimes more coins are being minted, sometimes fewer coins are being minted. There are political, economic reasons behind that. Coins aren't always lost at the same frequencies. This is partly why we generally have a lot more copper than silver or gold coins, depending on the period anyway, whether there were silver and gold coins. But copper coins tend to be more easily lost, in part because people care a little bit less about keeping them. There are sort of other factors as well. Some coins remain in circulation for a very long time. Some coins don't remain in circulation for a very long time. This is actually a problem that Alan Walmsley noted when talking about the early Islamic period in northern Jordan, was that in some cases they have evidence from places like Jerash and Pella that 6th century coins are staying in circulation for centuries, in some cases into the 7th, even 8th century. And so one of Alan Walmsley's points was that's a bit of it's a bit of a problem if we're reliant on coins for dating, that we have these layers where it actually turns out they're early Islamic, but they would have been dated late Byzantine if you were very reliant on the coins, just because those coins continued to circulate. People continued to attach value to them and trade them with each other in these sort of small day-to-day transactions. And so those are the things that we have to watch out for a bit, and it's what makes it more difficult for us to rely on numismatic evidence if we're trying to date an earthquake destruction. In some cases, that would give us a very reliable date, but in other cases, it can mislead us a little. And for 419, a couple of factors come together that make it so that maybe that can mislead us a little bit. One thing that happens is the 4th century, and especially the later part of the 4th century, is one of the peak periods of coin production in the Roman Empire, or the very, very early Byzantine Empire, I guess. A lot of coins are produced in the 4th century. And one of the effects that seems to have is that it reduces the need to mint as much coinage during the 5th century. There's so much 4th century coinage in circulation that you don't need to continue adding as much coinage to circulation. Those 4th century coins are just continuing to circulate. Whether it's the exact cause or whether there's also an economic decline across the, especially Eastern Mediterranean during the early 5th century, that leads to a decline in the production of coinage, we know that this just seems to be something that occurs across the entire Eastern Mediterranean region. You have a lot less coinage that reliably dates to the 5th century, and especially the early 5th century, than you do that dates to the 4th century. And what that means for us is that as archaeologists, when we see an assemblage of coins, a group of coins, mostly dating to the 4th century, we can't immediately assume that people stopped living at this site in the 5th century. It's possible that they continued living there and that they were even engaged in a monetary economy, but that was primarily based on the exchange of these 4th century coins that continued to circulate. That is actually a pattern that we see across the southern Levant as well. So that was one of the things that led the excavators of Zantor to say maybe this destruction happened in 419. At Feinan, a German team led by Hans-Dieter Kintz collected a bunch of coins and also bought some coins, unfortunately, in the region around Herbert Feinan, and they found the same thing. Tons and tons of 4th century coins, but major drop off right around 420 AD, the early part of the 5th century. So unfortunately, that pattern is so typical that we can't use that fall off to date earthquake destructions reliably. And in this case, I think it has been a bit misleading, but on the other hand, it can be a little bit informative if we allow some of the coins that seem to put pressure on those dates to influence our reading a bit. So in the case of Zantor, yes, it's mostly an assemblage of coins predating 419, but there are a couple of coins that postdate that. And so if we start thinking, okay, what if we don't assume that these are intrusive, that these, somehow ended up in this context from a later context, that can lead us to start thinking, okay, what would we expect a 5th century assemblage to look like? Well, we would probably expect it to look like it was mostly made up of these earlier coins, these coins that were produced in such high volumes and that continued to circulate, with a fairly small number of these newer coins. And we have a fairly small number of these newer coins because there was a small number of those newer coins to circulate to begin with. And so as long as we keep in mind that all of these factors about how many coins are being produced, how many coins are being used, how many coins are being lost, are going to influence what a numismatic assemblage looks like, numismatics is an incredibly valuable tool. Obviously, of course, its main value is in telling us about economy. And I think for the 5th century, numismatists are still arguing about this a bit. Does that decline in coinage tell us that we have a massive decline across the empire in the 5th century? Or does it just tell us that the 4th century is such a peak, such a period of overproduction, that the 5th century is kind of a return to normal, but it appears like a decline in comparison, which I guess would be a decline too, but maybe not a decline in the sense of a huge decline. It's basically just things aren't quite as good as they were before, but they're still pretty good. And that's kind of a question that's, again, is something that, numismatists are asking about the economy, archaeologists are asking about the economy, that has to influence how we're using coins as we're trying to date things like earthquakes too. We have to understand that those economic factors have a big impact on what we actually see. It's sort of the same thing when we start thinking about like periods where we just don't find many coins at all. That doesn't mean that there wasn't occupation during those periods, but it might mean that some of the regions we're looking at were not as integrated into monetary economies as others. So at a lot of village sites, for example, we tend to just find fewer coins because in general, coins are probably not used as much in day-to-day transactions in villages where they're used, of course, all the time, day-to-day in cities. So again, that's something we have to keep in mind.
What buildings were impacted in Petra by the earthquake of 1418, 1419? We have Al-Zantur, Urn Tomb, and northeastern Petra projects as the main sites affected by the earthquake from 1418, 1419.
Theoretically, yeah, those are the sites where there have been destructions that have potentially been identified as relating to that earthquake. For the Urn Tomb is kind of a complicated case. So the excavations revealed that the Urn Tomb is, of course, not just the tomb facade that we see, but there are these structures outside of the Urn Tomb too. There are actually a number of houses, for example, that are built in the late Roman period. And one of those, what we seem to see is it's destroyed in the 363 earthquake, it's rebuilt, and then it starts to be used as a quarry, essentially, probably in the 6th century. And what I mean by that is basically that there's evidence that people were coming in and removing the stones to use in something else, which is actually a very, very common feature at most sites, really most sites where you have earlier architecture. When you think about it, it's pretty sensible. If you're going to build a new structure, it's a lot easier to go and use cut stone that somebody else has already cut than go cut your own stone. Even modern construction, we kind of think about this. It's much easier to go buy like, pre-cut stone, pre-cut tile, pre-cut whatever than it is to go out to a quarry somewhere and mine your own stone and cut it yourself and all of that. And actually we see that even in the late Roman II phase at Zontour, there's sort of that famous, if you've been to Petra and seen Zontour, that famous wall where there are the circular stones that are just column drums that have been reset as foundation stones for the wall. So that's what's going on in Urn Tomb House 2 in the 6th century. And the excavators didn't suggest this, but the excavators of Zontour thought, okay, maybe the Urn Tomb is being used as a quarry because it was destroyed in the earthquake of 419. Some of the evidence from those excavations is still at some level forthcoming. So we don't know, we don't have full publication of all of the pottery from that Byzantine phase of the Urn Tomb houses. It's difficult to say whether there's pottery post-dating 419 or not. But there are other things that might be going on at that site. So we don't really have like a conclusive reason to say this was abandoned in 419. And it seems like it actually might be likely that the reason it was abandoned was not that it was destroyed in an earthquake, but that in the 450s, the Urn Tomb is reused as a church. And so it's possible that as part of that reconsecration and dedicating the space to religious uses, the residents maybe were asked to leave, maybe they had already left, but that abandonment might just be associated with, okay, the use of this space has changed a lot. It's not primarily a domestic space anymore, it's primarily a sacred space, and that kind of changes the layout of the space as well. We see this on the North Ridge too. So the area around the Petra Church in the 4th century certainly had been basically a suburb, had been a domestic area that was primarily houses. And those houses mostly go out of use when the Petra Church is built, again, maybe for the same reason. And so in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, we actually do see a lot of the maybe formerly residential, formerly slightly off the main path of the colonnaded street and that kind of area space. Some of it is being rededicated to these sacred purposes as Petra becomes increasingly Christian. And so the Urn Tomb might be part of that process rather than it being related to an earthquake. Although, who knows, it remains possible, but I think less likely that that's a 419 destruction. And the Northeastern Petra project structures, we can't say very much about yet in terms of their secure occupation history, because so far the work that's been done in that area, the work that's been published anyway, relates to surface survey and collection of surface finds. And so there's some evidence from that some of those structures might have been destroyed, but the assertion that it's a 419 destruction rests mostly on comparison to Zontour, because we don't have evidence from excavation of exactly when it was abandoned. And surface survey is a very useful tool. It tells us a lot, but it won't tell us that much. We don't get precise dates for events from surface survey. We get a sense of the broad overall occupation. And that's telling us that there probably is a Byzantine occupation at Northeastern Petra project at some of those structures. And so that kind of just leaves Zontour, and I've sort of talked about that already, where the evidence from Zontour, if we take it both as a complete group and we let some of those pieces of evidence talk to each other, so like the later material individually, any individual piece, we could say like, okay, that's just one piece. That doesn't mean that the whole thing is later. But if we start saying, well, in many categories of artifacts, We have things that on their own, maybe they're one-offs, maybe they appear a little bit earlier, but together, if you find a lot of those, it starts telling us, okay, we probably do have a later occupation here. And so I think the evidence, and then comparing it to the rest of Petra, where we have two destructions in a similar way in the Byzantine period, all of that probably starts to push us toward thinking that Zontura actually has a 4th century and 6th century destruction, and that while there is 5th century material, we get continuity through the 5th century and not an end in the early 5th century. So yeah, in Petra, I started the project not necessarily convinced one way or the other. As I said, I sort of started the project because I wanted to see about the date for these lamps. I thought it was strange that they were dated earlier at some of these sites than at most other sites in the region. But I was, prepared to accept at the beginning that they just appear earlier. Maybe they're produced in Petra, so we see them earlier in Petra, and they appear later everywhere else. And I kind of, as someone who's interested in the effects that sort of natural environment has on settlements, I'm very interested in what earthquakes actually did cause damage and what earthquakes people in southern Jordan are adapting to and suffering through. And so certainly I was pretty open to the idea that there might be an early 5th century earthquake that's causing a lot of destruction, but as I looked at the evidence more and more, it kind of pushed me away from that opinion. I think seismically for southern Jordan, the 5th century was a bit quieter than the 4th and 6th centuries in comparison. And so in Petra, maybe we just don't have 419 destruction layers. It, of course, remains possible. I mean, anything in archaeology is possible if we find the evidence that tells us that it happens. But at the moment, I don't think there's great evidence for it.
What evidence we have at the Petro Church? What excavators identified in the Petro Church, and how they dated these layers?
Right. So the Petra Church is a very interesting excavation, right? This was an excavation that was conducted by Acor, and it's a project that unfortunately becomes very complicated because of the death of the head excavator of the project. And so it really is kind of a phenomenal undertaking that the people who put together the Petro Church final publication volume managed to put together such an impressive volume on it because of that. Basically, like a lot of it's always a very tragic situation, and it's kind of very difficult to recover from that in some ways. Somebody has to sort of step up and take the lead. Zbigniew Fiema stepped up and really took the lead on that. But that also kind of complicated what that team was able to do and what they were able to publish. And I think had that project gone on longer and had it gone more according to plan, more of that material probably would have been published in final form. So in particular, the ceramic publication from the Petra Church is very good, but it's not very complete. A lot of the ceramics were analyzed, but very few of them were actually presented. And so it's difficult to go back through and see exactly what ceramic forms are causing the team to date certain layers to a certain period. What we have in the report, though, and what is maybe informative if we're thinking about the dates they proposed versus the dates that some of the dates that I've suggested, and some of the dates also that the team working on the North Ridge, so Patricia Bakai and Megan Perry, have suggested, is that most of the 5th century forms they identified, they're not totally presented in the ceramic reports, but they're described. most of those forms are dated with comparison to the material from Zuntur. And Ivan Gerber, who did most of the ceramics from the Petra Church, published most of the ceramics from the Petra Church, points out there are forms at the Petra Church that at other sites in Jordan, we know they have longer lives. They continue into the 6th century, maybe even the 7th century in some cases. But at the Petra Church, she dates them to the 5th century because of comparison to Azantur, because they're the same fabric, and so they seem to be from the same production. And that implies that if we're now thinking that the Zuntur dating is too narrow, that Zuntur actually continues into the 6th century, some of those forms at the Petra Church might also be longer lived. It doesn't mean that they're not 5th century, but it does mean that some of them might be 6th century. So to kind of make a long story short, what the excavators of the Petra Church identified was, as I mentioned before, this, we might call it a suburban area, a domestic area of Petra in the area of the Petra Church. And that seems to post-date the earthquake of 363. So there might have been something there before, it's destroyed in 363, then they build this suburb on top of it. It might be that there's not very much up there, and in 363, they sort of move into this area. We know from the excavations by Tom Parker and Megan Perry farther along the North Ridge that there is occupation preceding 363 there. And actually that North Ridge occupation seems to end in 363. They have nothing later, unfortunately. So perhaps some group of people moved slightly to the west on the North Ridge, and they're living in the area around the Petra Church after 363 in the late 4th century. Then what the excavators proposed is probably, they said in the 5th century, the Petra Church is built. In the 6th century, it's modified to the structure that we see now. So initially, the church was built as what's called a monoapsidal church. So it only had one curved apse in the center, and off to the two sides were square rooms. That's converted to the structure that we see now, which is a triapsidal church, a church with 3 curved apses at the ends. And then, of course, the most remarkable discovery from the Petra Church is the Petra papyri, which have told us probably more about the economy of Petra in the later Byzantine period than in some ways we might have hoped to know otherwise. Really quite revealing. So one of the things the Petra papyri tell us, because they were found in the Petra Church, basically carbonized, so they had been burnt in a fire. That event, that fire, has to have occurred at some point very late in the 6th century, because the latest dated Petra papyri date to the last decade of the 6th century. Might have been a bit later than that, but that kind of sets our terminus post quem for the church burning down. And then after that, we do have some reuse, probably not as a church anymore, but maybe as domestic space. We see this at the other sites on the North Ridge too. So the Blue Chapel and the Ridge Church undergo kind of a similar process. Probably we see more earthquake destructions after that. There's probably one in something like 748, 749. There are a lot of earthquakes that occur in the middle of the 8th century, so it's hard to pin it down to exactly one, but there's probably a destruction then. And gradually in the early Islamic period, it just goes out of use. I think the reevaluation of the material from Zuntur, though, and then looking at some of the material from the Petra Church, might lead us to very slightly revise some of these dates. And it doesn't really massively change our understanding of the church. These are very minor correctives. But one thing that was sort of troubling was that in the foundation layer for one of the walls of the church, so the ecclesiastical structure itself, there was 6th century, well, I would say coinage, there was a 6th century coin. And taken with the fact that the 5th century date for the construction of the church was mostly based on comparison to the Zuntur material, some of which actually probably does date to the 6th century. I think it might be more likely that the initial construction of the Petra Church takes place in the early 6th century rather than the 5th. Not a huge change, but it might be just a little bit later. And there's sort of this whole discussion also maybe to be had about church forms, because in like the 80s and 90s in particular, there was this idea that, especially in the south, in the Naqab and in southern Jordan, churches built in the 5th century have this monoapsidal structure, and then all of them are converted to triapsidal in the 6th century. And it turns out that excavations since then have really complicated this. So like we have triapsidal churches that are actually a little bit too early. We have monoapsidal churches that are way too late. We have monoapsidal churches at Humayma being built still in the 6th century, even 7th century in some places. We have triapsidal churches built in the 5th century that are rebuilt on a triapsidal plan in the 6th century. There's a much wider range of possibilities that seem to depend more on the needs of the local population, on, in some cases, the specific type of Christianity being practiced by the local population, the specific beliefs of that local population. And so sort of this idea that, okay, we've got a monoapsidal church built in the 5th century and then it's modified in the 6th century. We know that that's not quite the case anymore. And so the Petro Church being built in the early 6th century doesn't have to be the case that it's built in the 5th because it's monoapsidal. It could be a late monoapsidal church, and it might very well be. That modification to a triapsidal plan seems to have occurred more toward the middle of the 6th century. The excavators initially placed it in the early part of the 6th century, but they also recognized that they couldn't date that very precisely. And the other excavations on the North Ridge also push us toward this date. So again, Patricia Buckeye and Megan Perry, in their excavations at the Ridge Church and the Blue Chapel, just north of the Petra Church, they've actually suggested the same thing. All of those structures undergo a similar renovation, probably around the same time. And they've also suggested that it's probably the middle of the 6th century, not the early 6th century. So again, it doesn't massively change our understanding of it, but it's slightly different. And then, of course, as we start to get later and later, we're a bit more constrained. So the fire that destroyed the Petra Church, of course, still has to happen at least at the end of the 6th century. And I would suggest the excavators didn't necessarily think this at the time, and I'm not sure there's as much evidence for a total destruction, but it's possible that that fire is also the result of the late 6th century earthquake that we know affected most of the Petra region. So again, causes destruction on Jebel Harun, probably causes destruction at Zantur. That's the final collapse of the Great Temple. The Temple of the Winged Lions, maybe or maybe not, has something. The theater probably has a destruction. And so it's possible, even if the Petra Church doesn't collapse, that stuff gets knocked over during this earthquake, and possibly that starts a fire. Maybe that's the cause of the fire that's ironically kind of destroys the building, but preserves the Petra papyri for us to find centuries later.
Thank you so much for this detailed presentation. If you want to add something, please go ahead. What are your plans? For the end, I'm going to ask you this question. What are your professional plans in 2022? Are you planning to come back to Jordan and research Petra or Wadi Fainan?
That is a very good question. So for the upcoming year, one of the major professional plans I actually have, and this is perhaps related to what we've been talking about, our project in Wadi Fainan with Tom Levy and Mohammed Najjar, that specific project has gone into its final publication phase. And so this year we're hoping to have a final excavation report volume for the excavations at Khabit Nakib al-Samar medieval copper production site prepared. we're in the process of preparing the final report for the later excavations at Herbet Fainan, so the Roman through Islamic periods. So a lot of the sort of things I mentioned a bit obliquely today about those destruction layers, we'll be working on actually getting those published and getting that out there. I do plan to return to Jordan in 2022, although I will actually be working not that far south, so not in Petra and not in Wadi Fainan, but it's Herbet al Balua on the Kerak Plateau, where who knows, we're mostly, I am mostly, so the project is mostly investigating the Iron Age occupation of the site. Of course, it's a very important Iron Age site. The Balua Stela comes from there. It's got a big Iron Age massive fortification. But there's a village that seems primarily to date to the middle and late Islamic periods in the southern part of the site. There's a lot of Mamluk and early Ottoman pottery, some pottery that appears to be Ayyubid as well. And there's a scatter of pottery in that area also that tells us that that occupation goes back earlier. So there's a bit of Nabatean and Roman pottery, much less than the Islamic pottery. But we'll be excavating and trying to understand the occupation history of that village. And if it is indeed continuously occupied from the Nabatean and Roman period into the later part of the Islamic period, that might be able to tell us something about that 6th century earthquake, because Balua is not far from Rabba or Areopolis, where we have the initial evidence of that earthquake from Fazi Zayedin's excavations. So yeah, that's the beginning of a new project. Hopefully we'll be working on that for several years, and that'll give us hopefully a much more detailed understanding of the settlement history of the Kerak Plateau in those later periods.
Thank you so much for your time. We're going to continue our collaboration. I'm going to follow what you publish in scientific magazines and what kind of projects you're involved with. I'm happy that you're moving from Fainan to Kerak, and probably you'll spend a couple of years working on that site.
Yeah, hopefully so. Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be here.
It's even bigger pleasure when you come and visit us in Jordan.
Yes, of course. Hopefully soon.
All the best.
All right, thank you. All the best to you too.